Emily Carter woke to the sound of her own breath breaking into shallow gasps as white light pressed through her eyelids, and the weight on her limbs told her she could not move. Leather cuffs circled her wrists and ankles, fixed to a narrow hospital bed set in the center of a penthouse bedroom that smelled of antiseptic and rain from an open terrace door. Panic surged before memory arrived, and when it did, it brought the last thing she recalled, which was Sebastian Reed, standing over her with eyes on fire right as fear climbed her throat again tonight. She tried to speak, and only a thin sound escaped as if her voice had been folded inward by terror. "Don't," she whispered, and the word fell apart into air. "Don't do this, please." The ceiling seemed to tilt, and the room held its breath while Sebastian stood at the foot of the bed with his hands open and trembling as if he was the one restrained. He looked nothing like the man on magazine covers tonight. There was no armor in his face, only a raw storm of dread and resolve that made her heart stumble hard against silence. "If you do not let us do this," he said quietly, and the calm in his voice frightened her more than shouting would have, "you will not survive the night." The doctor beside him nodded once and reached for a syringe, while another nurse adjusted the monitors that chimed in small steady notes. Emily shook her head in helpless refusal, tears slipping into her hair as the truth struck her with a cold blade, that her body was no longer safe even inside this room. She believed he was ending her life, and that belief ripped through her like glass. Sebastian stepped closer, and she saw that his eyes were wet not with weakness but with something like surrender. "I would trade everything for one more hour of your breath," he said, and the words hovered between them as the doctor pressed the needle into the line on her arm. A burn spread, then a warmth, then black spots swam at the edge of her sight. As the drug worked, he leaned down, so only she could hear him, and when he spoke, her fear cracked open into stunned disbelief. "You were poisoned tonight by a call you should not have heard." "Have heard," he finished, and the words carved through her as memory flashed of a late hallway, light a voice through a glass door, and a name that made her stomach fold in on itself: Victoria. The air felt too thin suddenly, and the room drifted as the medicine carried her downward. He gripped the rail of the bed as if it were the edge of a cliff, and she realized with a shock of clarity that the man who terrified her now was bleeding in a place she had never been allowed to see for the first time tonight. The monitors steadied, and the doctor announced the first small victory as the antidote met the poison in her blood. Emily sank into a drifting half-sleep, where sound bent and light softened. Through it all, she felt Sebastian beside her, counting each breath like a vow he was afraid to break. In that floating space, the truth slid into place, that the danger had not been her job or her silence but the bloodline that owned this room. When she surfaced again, his hand was around hers, and the lights were dim with the city breathing rain beyond glass. When the worst passed, he finally spoke of what could not be undone, that the call she heard came from his mother, and that the decision to hurt her had been made using his name. The words struck Emily harder than the poison could, and she understood in a blur that the man she thought was her executioner had been the shield. Yet the old wound in her chest burned the memory of another night years ago, when a signature from this same man erased her family from their home and drove her father into despair without mercy or choice. The truth hovered between them, unspoken and ruthless, and she turned her face away as tears gathered, because it was too much to hold both gratitude and hatred in one trembling heart. Sebastian said nothing as he brushed damp hair from her cheek, and the simple care almost hurt more than the cuffs ever had. Outside, thunder rolled across the river, and the night folded itself back over the city. Emily closed her eyes, knowing that she had been spared for a reason she did not yet understand, and that the man who saved her tonight was the same man. Emily woke to a quieter world 2 days later, with rain thinning to mist against the glass, and the smell of disinfectant fading into coffee from somewhere beyond the door. Sebastian did not speak much when she recovered enough to sit up, and when he did, it was only to explain what the doctors confirmed and what the house would change to protect her. She answered softly and never met his eyes. Every time his name passed a doorway, her shoulders tightened, and her gaze dropped as if the floor carried safer truths than his face. He noticed it immediately, the way she angled her body away when he entered a room, the way she shifted her weight as if ready to flee though she never ran. It was not the flinch of fear alone, but a practiced avoidance shaped by memory. The staff whispered that she was shy, that she had been through a shock, that she would adjust. Sebastian had seen many kinds of silence in boardrooms and hospitals, but this was different, because it accused him without a word and he could not tell why. When the cuffs were removed and the leads unclipped, she returned to her uniform with a steadiness that looked like dignity from a distance and like survival up close. She folded sheets with perfect corners and moved through the grand rooms like a shadow that cleaned light behind it. If he passed her in a hall, she bowed her head and murmured good morning without lifting her lashes. He told himself to respect the boundary, yet the room felt emptier each time she refused to look at him. He tried small mercies that carried no power in them: a cup of tea left on the side table, a note excusing her from heavy work, a quiet word to the supervisor to ease her hours. Each kindness made her quieter. Gratitude should have softened the air between them, but instead it deepened the distance, because gratitude acknowledged a debt, and Emily had a debt she would not repay with her eyes. Even at meals, when other staff laughed, she kept her gaze trained on the china, as if the pattern could answer her better than he ever could. The day he asked her a simple question about the roses on the terrace, she startled as if a bell had rung inside her chest. "They are late this year," she said, and then stopped herself and bowed her head again. He watched the color drain from her cheeks and realized that speaking to him cost more than silence. The discovery tightened something behind his ribs that had not been touched by profit or loss. He dismissed her with care, and she moved away at once, relieved to escape the sound of his voice. At night, she lay awake in the small room assigned to her, and listened to the building breathe through pipes and distant traffic. The antidote had cleared the poison, yet its echo lingered in heat and dizziness that frightened her when dawn came too slowly. In those hours, she saw her father as he had been before the papers arrived, the table warm with dinner steam, his hands steady as he planned a future that would not come. She pressed her face into the pillow and reminded herself that she worked in the house of the man who signed that future away. Sebastian avoided his own bed those first nights, and slept instead on a couch near the study where he could hear the city and pretend the rhythm was control. He replayed the call she had overheard like a wound that would not close, and measured every movement of the house, as if danger might still slip within it. Yet the greatest unrest came from the spaces where her presence brushed his thinking and left questions without answers. Why would a maid fear a man who had just saved her life, unless salvation itself carried a history he did not own? In the mornings, when the elevator doors opened to the service wing, he felt the air change before he saw her. The quiet became deliberate, the way a room falls still for news it cannot refuse. She passed him once with a tray, and the clink of porcelain sounded louder than it should. For an instant her eyes lifted and met his by accident, and what flashed there was not terror but grief, like a tide held back too long. She looked away at once, and the loss unsettled him more than any accusation spoken aloud. He asked the head of staff about her file, and received only thin facts: a local school left early, a sequence of short-term jobs, a recommendation secured without fuss. No scandal followed her, only a careful vanishing from places before roots could grow. He searched public records and found a name that matched hers on an old foreclosure, tied to a block cleared by one of his earliest redevelopment projects. The date aligned with the year he had signed with the careless speed of a younger man drunk on scale. Understanding did not arrive as forgiveness, but as a slow burn that climbed his throat. If this was the thread that bound them, then every kindness he offered was a mirror held to harm he had never faced. He could rescind a contract, yet time had already claimed what it wanted from her family. That night he stood on the terrace and watched mist roll across the river, and wondered how many lives had been reshaped by his pen, without his knowing, and how many had learned his name as a curse, long before it became a brand. The next time he encountered Emily, he did not speak. He set a folded scarf on the nearest chair, and stepped back, so the gesture carried no command. She hesitated, then took it as one accepts weather, and wrapped the wool around her shoulders. Their eyes did not meet yet. The small exchange threaded warmth through the room like a promise that did not yet dare to become a question. When she left, he noticed that her steps were lighter, as if someone had eased a weight she refused to name. Days gathered into a thin routine of near glances and careful gaps. He chose her car on the busiest afternoons, so she would not walk into the rain, and later claimed convenience to spare her the burden of thanks. She repaid him with flawless work and a silence that protected them both. Yet, in the quiet, he sensed a storm turning under the floorboards of her composure, and feared the moment it would rise, because storms demanded witnesses, and he did not know if he deserved to be one. On the evening she returned the scarf freshly pressed, she finally looked up long enough to let him see the conflict she carried like a hidden scar. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled, and she said only, "Thank you for the night I lived." The words cut through him with gentle precision, because they granted him no absolution, only a fact. As she turned away, he felt the strange certainty that whatever saved her body had awakened a reckoning between them, and that her lowered gaze was the line she drew to keep the truth from breaking them both too soon. Emily had learned his name long before she learned his face, and it had never been spoken softly in her house. Sebastian Reed was not a man when she first heard of him, but a signature at the bottom of a letter, and then a headline that never printed her father's name. At 16, she watched her mother fold the paper with hands that shook as if the future had turned to glass. The redevelopment meant progress for a city and extinction for a street, and the notice came with clean language that said nothing about the rooms where birthdays had been marked on doorframes, or the porch where her father sat each night, listening to radios that no longer mattered. When the locks changed, the house fell silent the way a mouth does when it loses a tooth, and her father carried that silence into every room they rented after. He did not blame her yet. The world narrowed around him as if the walls were closing at an angle only he could feel. By the time the bank took the second place, his laughter had grown careful and thin. Emily remembered the night he tried to teach her how to cook rice without watching it, and failed because he kept watching it anyway, and in the morning she found an envelope in his section of a dresser, with nothing but receipts and an effed apology folded too many times. The city called it a choice later, the neighbors called it despair, but Emily learned to call it the moment Sebastian Reed became real in her life. She learned to hate a man she had never met, because hating him kept the grief from spilling everywhere it did not belong. Years passed in rooms that never stayed long enough to feel owned, and she studied in borrowed libraries, with borrowed quiet until borrowed time ran out. Work replaced school and pride learned a new shape. The night she saw him on a screen at the airport smiling beside officials as cameras flashed, she felt the old heat rise under her ribs, and she turned away as if the light itself could accuse her of wanting what had taken so much. When the agency placed her in his building, she tried to refuse, and the refusal failed on rent and groceries, and hope that learned how to plead when it had no other language. She promised herself she would not look at him, and when she did by accident, she would remember the letter that carried his name like a blade kept clean by distance. In the penthouse, she learned his habits without permission, the way he paused before thresholds, as if rooms were decisions, the way he loosened his collar when the day had asked too much, the way his voice softened when he spoke to children. On video calls he ended quickly. These details unsettled her because monsters were meant to be simple, and he was not. She reminded herself that kindness did not restore a house, and gentleness did not unwrite ink. Some nights when the river was loud and sleep refused her, she imagined confronting him and watched the words scatter before they reached his mouth, because in truth, she did not want vengeance, she wanted the world to have been different, and neither he nor she could give that to her. Sebastian sensed the shape of the shadow he cast, long before he confirmed it. The foreclosure file he found led him to a narrow street, where the city had paved over stories, and he stood there in a suit that drew stares, and felt no triumph at all. He had been young when he inked the deal, and louder than caution, and the market rewarded him for speed. He had approved the relocation package, assuming dollars were flexible enough to absorb loss, and he had not watched where the families went when the trucks pulled away. Now the river moved where a row of kitchens once steamed, and the lesson arrived late and intact and unforgiving. Her avoidance grew clearer to him as a discipline, not a fear, and that difference altered everything. When he finally spoke her name in a corridor, she stiffened as if the sound itself crossed a boundary, and he understood that the boundary did not belong to the house but to time. He asked if he could walk her to the service elevator, and she said nothing and walked anyway because the job demanded movement even when the heart refused it. Inside the mirrored box he saw the reflection of a man who had mistaken power for repair, and a girl who had learned how to be smaller than her history. The elevator hummed between floors, and he told her he was sorry for something he could not yet name without sounding like a plea meant to absolve him. She shook her head once, and said softly, "You do not owe me words, you cannot give meaning to," and the floor opened, and she stepped into work as if it were a shield. That night, he returned to the terrace, and spoke into the rain, as if it might remember better than he had. He imagined offering money and felt the insult in the thought. He imagined offering time and felt the impossibility. The world had taught her to survive him, and unlearning that lesson would ask for more than apology. Emily felt the city press around her on her way down, and the familiar ache of carrying a hatred she did not want to keep because it had begun to tangle with something else she had no name for yet. She resented him for the signature and for the kindness, and for the way his concern complicated her resolve. At work, she heard the others speak of him as a force that bent weather, and she kept one hand on the plain gold ring she wore for her father, as if it anchored memory to bone. When he passed, she counted steps, and when he paused, she measured breath, and in the quiet between them, she sensed a question neither of them dared to ask, which was whether men could change enough to meet the people they had once displaced. The poison in her blood had altered the present, and the file he found had altered the past, and both pressed them toward a future neither had prepared. In rare moments she saw his eyes carry something like shock at his own reflection, and she felt the treacherous stir of empathy rise, and dropped her gaze as if it were fire at her feet. Hating him had been easy when he was distant, and the distance had protected her from uncertainty. Now that the distance was made of rooms, they shared it shrank daily, and with it shrank the certainty that sustained her anger. She feared that if she looked at him too long the story she had told herself would loosen, and the loss would have to be carried in full again without the scaffolding of blame. Sebastian waited for a chance to speak that did not demand forgiveness, and did not hide behind payment. He rehearsed sentences and discarded them until all that remained was a wish without a verb. On the evening, she lingered by the window to watch lightning bruise the clouds. He joined her at a careful remove, and neither spoke until thunder closed the space between their quiet. He said, "I am trying to learn how to listen to what I broke," and she said, "I am trying not to become only what I lost," and the honesty stunned them both, because it asked for nothing and promised nothing, and that was perhaps the most dangerous ground of all. When she stepped away he stayed, and felt the question of choice begin its slow, unrelenting climb. Power failed at dusk, and the penthouse dimmed into a soft gray where reflections hovered like water. Emergency lights stitched thin paths along the floor, and the terrace doors whispered as wind pushed rain against glass. Emily carried folded linens when the lights blinked again, and disappeared entirely, leaving only the river glow and the city pulse beyond. Her step faltered and she slid on the polished floor. The tray tipped and linen spilled like pale wings. She reached for balance and found air. Sebastian was suddenly there, his shoulder firm beneath her hands, his breath quick with the same. He steadied her without a word, and the thunder rolled as if to witness the moment. Emily froze with the nearness of him, the warmth of his hand through fabric, the quiet authority of a body that never asked permission from space. She lifted her eyes before she could stop herself and met his. The city wrote silver lines across his face, and she saw not the titan of contracts but a man alarmed by his own pulse. The time stretched thin and the room listened. He released her and she swayed again, closer than either intended in sudden dark. They stood breathing in the shared shadow, and Emily felt the old vow tighten in her chest, not to look, not to soften, not to forgive. Yet the dark invited confession in small mercies, and she could feel his restraint gather like a held tide. He took half a step back to give her room, and in that courtesy she felt the ache of what might be. Outside sirens braided with rain and the building exhaled. He said her name as if it weighed something, and she answered with a nod. She did not trust the room, kept listening still. Emily bent to gather the fallen linen, and he knelt as well, their hands brushing once, and then retreating like startled birds. The contact burned through the gloves of her resolve, and she startled at herself more than at him. He watched the pulse in her wrist as if counting courage. "Do you need anything?" he asked, and the neutrality of it nearly undid her. She shook her head and the lie slid out clean. He rose first and offered distance like a gift she was afraid to open. The emergency lights flickered once, and held rain-traced silver veins. Later she retreated to her small room, with the scarf folded at the foot of the bed, and the storm eased into a hush. Her pulse would not slow. She pressed her palms to the mattress, and felt the echo of his steadiness, as if he had left a mark that wanted remembering. She told herself that attraction was only physics responding to danger, and rescue tied too close together to tease apart. Yet when thunder murmured, she heard his voice again, not as command but as shelter she had never asked for, and the want frightened her so much. Sebastian stood on the dark side of the terrace with rain slicking his hair, and tried to name the fault line that had opened when her eyes met his. He had kept his hands to himself by instinct, sharpened with far older discipline than desire, yet the near miss left a tremor in his control. He told himself that gratitude breeds illusion and that power distorts hunger into claim. He repeated it until the words thinned. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. He wanted to keep her safe, and the wanting wanted him back with a quiet, implacable pull. The days that followed carried a charged politeness like glass laid over flame. He did not seek her yet, he found her in doorways of thought, and she did not speak to him yet, she answered, when he was near by the careful angle of her shoulders. Rumors softened then sharpened as staff sensed a gravity they could not chart. Emily kept her vow and did not look yet. She counted his steps by sound, and could tell when the floor sighed beneath his weight. The house learned a new silence that leaned toward breath rather than fear at edge. On the third evening, the generator failed and the security lights dimmed to embers again. A storm braided the sky into ash and silver, and the river rose in a low, roaring choir. Emily carried towels to the spa corridor, and the floor dipped under her wet shoes. She would have fallen had he not caught her at the corner by reflex and by choice together. For a breath they were locked in balance, his hand at her waist, hers at his sleeve, and the world narrowed to the contact they pretended not to feel until thunder shook the glass. He did not move first, and neither did she, and that stillness became the question both had been avoiding. Her heart beat too loudly, and she feared he could hear it and take it as permission. He leaned closer without crossing the last inch, as if testing the law of her breath. The city flared blue and white outside with lightning, and in that charged second his mouth hovered near hers and her body answered before her history could object. She closed her eyes to stop seeing the man who had ruined her, and to keep the man who wanted. He stopped himself, and the restraint rang like a bell struck underwater, loud and distant at once. Emily exhaled the breath she had been holding, and the loss of what had almost occurred left her dizzy. He released her waist and stepped back as if retreat were the only way to preserve them from the truth they had nearly spoken with skin. "I should go," he said, and the roughness in his voice betrayed the cost. She nodded, unable to trust her mouth. When he turned away, the storm seemed to follow him, and the heat he left behind startled. She stood in the afterimage of him as rain smoothed the night clean again, and felt the two truths collide in her chest, that he had saved her life, and that he had taken her father's without knowing. The almost kiss became a fault line, and she knew she would live on either side of it, no longer able to pass as if nothing had changed. In her room, she pressed the scarf to her face and breathed in rain and soap, and something that might have been linen warmed by hands. She hated the comfort and kept it anyway. Sleep came in pieces, and in each piece she saw the same near moment, replayed with different endings. In one he kissed her and she forgave everything. In another she pushed him away, and kept the past intact like a wall that never crumbled. At dawn she rose with a quiet clarity that frightened her more than fear had, because it asked her to choose, and she had been trained only to endure. Downstairs, the house returned to its rituals, and he moved through them with eyes that avoided mirrors, as if they asked questions he could not yet answer. By evening the storm returned in a gentler guise, and with it the expectancy that follows lightning. Emily passed him once at the stairwell, and neither paused, yet both felt the thread tighten. He had nearly crossed a line and learned that he did not trust himself not to cross it again. She had nearly let him and learned that her body would not always obey the stories her grief had written. The night he almost kissed her did not end with a kiss, yet it rewrote the grammar of their future quietly and without permission, and the house felt. The secret lived in Emily like a thin wire pulled tight through her ribs, steady enough to breathe around yet sharp enough to cut whenever she moved too fast toward hope. She carried it through corridors and into warm rooms and back to the small square of her own bed, where the city hummed through glass and the past slipped from its leash. She had known before she ever met him, because the file had first been shown to her by a counselor who believed that naming the source of a wound might help it close, and she learned then how wrong good intentions could be. The signature sat at the bottom of the document with the confidence of money that had never waited for grief to finish speaking, and when the counselor said the name aloud, it struck her as ordinary as rain, which made the damage feel larger, because it could be done by anyone. She folded the file away like a letter she would never send, and told herself she wanted nothing from the man in the photograph. Years taught her that wanting is a stubborn creature that grows even in dry places. Now she stood in the house he owned, and felt the wire quiver whenever he passed, and the quiver frightened her because it felt like longing, and her father had taught her to distrust anything that arrived without permission. After the night of the almost kiss, she learned how quickly the body can betray the stories the mind has told for survival. She began to measure truth by the steady weight of it, rather than by the heat of the moment, and the steady truth was that loving him would not resurrect her father, or restore a street that had been swallowed by light and glass. Yet another truth rose with equal stubbornness, that hating him no longer protected her from the ache that wanted to be seen. She avoided the places where silence gathered and took on extra shifts to keep her mind occupied with work that asked only for hands. Sebastian returned to his days with a restraint that held like a vow. He kept his distance not as withdrawal but as care, and that made her breath catch because care asked for gratitude, and gratitude threatened to look like forgiveness. In meetings he spoke with the precision that had built towers and the gentleness that had not yet learned what to do with itself. He did not look for her, and she did not seek him, yet they met at the hinge points of the house, as if drawn by a careful magnet neither would name. On a gray afternoon she entered the study to dust, and found him alone at the table with the city blurred behind him, and the light traced the lines at his eyes that ambition had not smoothed away. She paused at the door, and he looked up as if he had been waiting without admitting it. For a moment neither moved, and the wire inside her sang. He thanked her for the scarf she had returned, and she surprised herself by answering with something like warmth. The ease of it shook her because it felt earned, though she had not yet earned the right to give it. As she worked, he watched the way she handled his space, as if every surface could bruise, and that reverence tugged at a place in him that had not been mapped by markets. He asked her if she ever missed the neighborhood she grew up in, and she felt the wire tighten another fraction. The question held no accusation, yet it struck the center of the wound with exquisite accuracy. She answered with a truth that did not reveal the blade. "I miss my father," she said, and the room listened. He nodded once and said, "I know what it is to lose a parent," without knowing that his loss had arrived wrapped in fortune rather than eviction. The cruelty of that symmetry nearly made her laugh, and the laugh almost became a sob. She finished the room quickly, and left with her heart loud in her ears. That night she stood by the river and let the cold air numb her face until the wire slackened enough to think. The poison attempt had taught her what secrets could cost, and she wondered how long her silence would remain a shield before it became another weapon aimed at him and at herself. She saw the future like a divided road, one path where she spoke, and the wreckage spread across everything she had learned to touch, and another where she stayed quiet, and the lie became a habitat she would one day forget how to leave. When she returned, she found him in the hallway, speaking softly to a doctor on the phone about the last of her blood work, and the care in his voice stirred a heat she resented. He ended the call, and for a second they stood as they had in the dark, with too much left unsaid. He asked if the river always looked like it did tonight, and she said it depended on what you brought to it, and the answer surprised them both, because it named the choice neither had yet made. In his study later, he opened the old project files and read them, not as profit but as consequence, and the numbers rearranged themselves into families he had never learned to count. He found the relocation addresses and traced them like a slow apology he could not yet speak. One of the addresses led nowhere, and when he called the listed phone it did not ring. The absence felt like an indictment. Emily lay awake and remembered her father's last ordinary morning, the way he had stood at the sink with a cup that was already clean and said nothing of the water running, because he could not find a different sound that might keep him in the room. She had loved him into silence, and then learned how to keep quiet herself. Loving Sebastian now felt like stepping back into the same river, with new rain falling, and she was afraid she would not know how to swim a second time. The house quieted and the hours collected. Before dawn she rose and wrote a letter she did not sign, and told the truth with care, because care was the only currency she had left. She folded it and hid it in the lining of her uniform, where it pressed against her like a second heart. She did not know if she would ever give it to him yet, and the not knowing was its own form of keeping faith with the dead. In the morning she crossed him by the stair, and for the first time she did not lower her eyes right away. He felt the change like weather, and paused as if the air had called his name. Their gazes held for a beat that lengthened, and in that quiet he saw not accusation, but grief braided with restraint, and something that looked too much like love for him to be certain it was not hope mirroring itself in his own eyes. He wanted to reach for her, and gathered his hands instead. She wanted to tell him, and kept the wire taut. The secret that would destroy him was no longer only hers, and that truth weighed with the promise and the peril of what it meant to love a man whose past had already loved her family into the ground. The news reached the house the way cold reaches bone, without warning and without mercy, and by the time Emily heard it, the corridors were already humming with the low, controlled voices that meant decisions had been made far above anyone who carried linen or keys. Sebastian was to announce an engagement within the week, a strategic union with the daughter of a rival medical conglomerate meant to seal a merger that would triple market reach and quiet the board for a decade. It was all phrased in language that sounded like weather, and none of it asked who would be left standing in the wind. Emily learned from a passing whisper and felt the wire in her chest draw so tight it sang. The first thought that cut through the shock was relief that the storm would move away from her, and that relief shamed her because it arrived tangled with pain. The second thought was that the engagement would mean change, and change in this house always came for staff first, with polite words and boxes carried quietly down service elevators. By evening, the supervisor confirmed it gently with a hand on Emily's shoulder that the rooms would be restructured, and that most of the service wing would be released with compensation that assumed money solved fear. The floor seemed to tilt the way it had on the night the lights failed, and Emily held to the doorframe until the corridor steadied. Her father had lost a home to a signature, and now she would lose this fragile employment to another ceremony of ink and smiles, and she saw with bitter clarity how the pattern repeated across different skins. She did not plan to see Sebastian that night, yet when she passed the study, the door stood open, and his voice rose, then fell as he spoke to someone on the phone about timing and optics, and the words merged into an ocean of intent that did not include her. She felt something break loose from the wire inside, and move with purpose. She set the linen down where it fell, and walked into the room without knocking for the first time since she arrived. He looked up, startled, and she saw surprise flush then concern, as he registered the color in her face. Emily closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a choice, and the room seemed to empty of air. "You are doing it again," she said, and the words arrived steady, as if another part of her had been waiting to say them for years. He asked what she meant, and she shook her head as if to clear fog that had grown too thick to navigate with caution. "You sign your futures and other people are erased," she said, and only then did moisture rise in her eyes as the truth demanded payment. "The board wants stability," he said, because old reflex reached for reason before his heart could catch up. Stability for whom, she asked, and the question opened the shape of his life like a blade laid along a seam. He told her gently about the engagement, as if explaining weather, and she listened as if rain had learned to speak her name. He did not tell her about the restructuring because he did not have to, and that hurt him because he saw she already knew. Emily sank to her knees without warning, the movement so sudden it frightened them both, and the carpet offered no resistance to the weight of her plea. "Please," she said, and the word emptied itself into the room like a soft shatter. "Please do not destroy me again." The again landed like a bell struck under water, and he felt the reverberation in his lungs. He crossed the room and knelt without touching her, because the reflex to command had learned to pause. Emily looked up, and the mask she wore at work was gone, replaced with a young woman's terror that asked only to keep one small piece of ground. "If you let them clear us out," she said, "I will not survive the winter. The job market will not take me again. I am too slow now, too careful, too marked," and the words at the end meant more than employment, and he finally heard it. He wanted to tell her that money could solve this, and felt the insult in the thought because money had made it. He wanted to tell her she would be safe, and felt the lie gather because safety that depends on the weather of contracts is not safety at all. The room listened, and he remembered the night she almost fell, and the will he had spent to not close the last inch, and he understood with terrible clarity that every restraint he had built had been a rehearsal for a moment like this, where his choice would reveal who he was willing to be. He said nothing for a long breath, and that silence was the axis on which everything turned. Emily bowed her head and pressed her palms into the carpet, as if prayer could take form in pressure. When he spoke, his voice was low, and the effort to keep it steady gave it a tremor she had never heard from him. "I cannot promise the board," she said. "Do not give them your life," he answered, and the words startled them both because they recast the terrain. He did not say, "I cannot help you," he said, "I will not surrender you as collateral." She lifted her eyes and saw not power but a man standing at the edge of the only bridge he knew how to build. "If I stop this engagement," he said, "the board will set fire to everything I protect, and I do protect things. I am responsible for thousands of families now," and the arithmetic of his burden pressed against the arithmetic of her loss, until both numbers blurred. Emily shook her head and tears slid free at last. "You protected none of us before," she said, and the wound named itself without hatred. The honesty did not break him, it clarified him. "I know," he said, and the admission was plain and unadorned and therefore difficult. The clock on the wall marked seconds that felt like a court counting down to verdict. In the service wing, the supervisors waited, and in the city headlines warmed their type. Emily rose slowly because kneeling had said all it could, and she did not want him to remember her as a pleading shape. "Thank you for saving my life," she said, and the way she separated life from living made the air ache. She turned to go, and the distance she crossed with 3 steps felt larger than the river at flood. He said her name, and she stopped because she had always stopped for it. "I will not sign away your ground," he said, and the resolve in his voice arrived like a door set at last into a wall that had pretended to be permanent. "The board will retaliate," she said, and he answered, "Let them then," with a simplicity that stripped threat of its theater. Emily did not run back into his arms because their story had not earned that grammar yet, but she did turn, and in the space of a look they rewrote the terms of the room. Outside, the storm returned in a low growl, as if the sky had heard, and the city tilted toward night with a new sentence in its mouth. The engagement announcement was delayed with a single line that said discussions continued, and the board erupted in a chorus of warnings that promised efficient harm. In the service wing, the restructuring memo did not arrive, and the staff learned to breathe again in small increments that felt borrowed. Emily returned to work with a steadiness that held awe inside it like a hidden reservoir. She did not thank him with words because words would have cheapened the risk he had taken, and he did not ask for her gratitude because he could not afford its debt. When they passed in the hall that night, neither looked away, and in the shared glance the wire that had kept her rigid loosened one careful notch, as if the truth had shifted just enough to allow air inside the wound. The night after he refused the engagement, the house did not sleep, and neither did the city that fed on rumor and consequence. Phones kept breathing in distant rooms, and elevators whispered with restrained urgency as executives arrived and left without being announced. Emily moved through her duties as if the floor might tilt again at any moment, yet it did not, and the steadiness frightened her more than chaos would have. She felt him before she saw him standing at the end of the west corridor, with his jacket off, and his sleeves rolled as if he had traded ceremony for work. When their eyes met, there was no question left to hide behind because the question had already been answered with action. He had chosen to stop a future that promised profit, and in doing so, he had chosen a present that did not yet promise anything at all. The board called again before midnight, and he took the call in front of the glass wall that framed the river, as if he wanted the city to witness the weight of the decision. Emily did not listen to every word, yet the shape of the argument was plain, from the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw set on silences rather than on lines. When the call ended, he stood very still for a moment, then exhaled as if he had surfaced from deep water. She approached with a folded towel in her hands, using the excuse of work, because courage still borrowed masks when it needed to cross open ground. He thanked her, and the thanks carried more than the towel, because it acknowledged that something had altered between them. The next morning, the news broke that the merger talks were stalled, and that Reed Group stock dipped with a tremor that was less disaster than warning. Analysts spoke of leverage and long games and invisible pressure, and none of them spoke of a maid kneeling on carpet, with a winter in her eyes. The pressure arrived anyway, first as civil persuasion, then as veiled threat. Legal letters multiplied and meetings stacked like loaded plates. He faced them in the language he had mastered and declined to yield the name of his reason, because he would not let the board turn a person into a bargaining unit. Emily learned of the market dip from a news app on a phone. She kept on silent, and the idea that her plea had begun to move numbers made her dizzy with a power she did not want. She knew too well how quickly numbers learned to devour those who imagined control. When she saw him later, she told him quietly that he could walk this back, and no one would blame him for a pivot framed as prudence. He answered that prudence had been his god for too long, and that he had mistaken its favor for grace. The retaliation sharpened before the sun set for the second time. Victoria Reed requested a meeting, and the request carried the chill of command dressed as concern. Emily knew the mother's voice from the night of poison, and felt the wire tighten in warning. Sebastian went alone and returned with eyes that had learned something they had not known before. He did not speak of the meeting at first, and she did not ask, because the air between them had begun to learn its own grammar of restraint. That night, the service wing gathered in the small kitchen at the end of shift with whispers that braided fear with incredulity. The restructuring memo remained absent, third day in a row, and there were no boxes by the elevators. Some of the staff spoke his name with a gratitude that felt like disbelief unwrapped, and others spoke it with suspicion born from long practice. Emily listened and felt the dangerous warmth of hope spread where it had once been bitterly rationed. When she found him on the terrace watching the city unroll, she stood beside him without preface and said, "I will not be your reason if your mother makes this war personal." He smiled faintly and said, "She already has." The confession should have frightened her, yet it steadied her because, for the first time, the conflict lived where they could both see it. He told her that the board had offered compromises that kept the appearance of postponement, while punishing his authority in small, calibrated losses. He told her of properties delayed and loans repriced and committees that suddenly remembered his age. She heard in his voice the price of every inch he refused to concede, and the clarity with which he counted it. "You could win this and lose me," she said, and the truth fell without cruelty. He turned fully to her then, and the night took on the quality of a threshold. "I am not choosing between you and the company," he said. "I am choosing who decides what either of those words mean." The sentence did not absolve him, yet it gave her a footing strong enough to stand without pleading. 2 days later, the board moved to formal censure, and opened the question of his continued leadership with polite ferocity. The media sniffed blood in the water, and the storm the house had avoided began its visible work. Emily was reassigned to another floor without explanation, and she understood the gesture for what it was, a message delivered in silk. That evening, Sebastian found her in the narrow utility hallway, with a cart of folded sheets, and told her to clock out early without reason, and when she tried to refuse, he told her quietly that her safety was now a line he intended to draw, without committees. She gathered her jacket, and the wire inside her eased, because fear had a name and a plan again. They walked together to the edge of the lobby, and that ordinary act felt like a procession. Cameras waited outside like questions that had already decided their answers. He did not let go of her elbow, and the choice traveled through the building faster than rumor ever had. The flash burst across glass, and the sound startled her, but his hand steadied, and she did not pull free. In the car, the city rushed close and loud, and she realized with a small shock that this was the first time he had put his body between her and the noise of the world without thinking of what it would cost him later. The next morning, the headline framed the photograph with speculation, and the speculation framed her name with danger she had not agreed to wear. She tried to resign before lunch, and he refused to accept it, as if refusing could become a shield. They argued softly in the study where their voices had learned to be careful with one another, and the argument ended not in victory but in a pact that danger would be faced in shared light rather than in hiding. He chose her again by saying that the consequence had already arrived whether he wanted it or not, and that he would not compound it by denying who stood at its center. The board vote was set for the end of the week, and the house held its breath again. In the service wing, some avoided Emily, as if proximity invited disaster, and others slipped her notes of encouragement with hands that trembled from memory. She felt both the weight of their hope and the injustice of carrying it. On the eve of the vote, Victoria Reed sent a bouquet to the penthouse with a card that said, "This will all be easier if you stop fighting what is inevitable." Sebastian read it without expression, and placed the card in a drawer as if he were shelving a storm for later study. That night Emily could not sleep, and returned to the bad memory of kneeling, because kneeling had once moved the world, and she needed to remind herself that it had been his choice that moved it now. Near dawn he found her on the terrace wrapped in the scarf, and the city laid out like a map of risk behind her. He told her what the ballot likely held, and she told him she would not be the reason his life split into before and after. He answered that it had already split, and that the only honest question now was what would live on each side. The following afternoon the board convened, and the mahogany room learned a different register of quiet as he took his seat and waited. Names were called and votes were counted, and the arithmetic landed with a rarer sound than loss or gain. By a margin that looked like a warning more than a mandate, they moved to curtail his authority pending review. The market answered with a measured drop, and commentators performed their practiced reasoning. He walked out into light that did not care whether he belonged to it, and drove back to the river with the strange calm of a man who has stepped beyond the ledge he had studied all his life. Emily stood at the window when he returned and read in his walk the cost he had accepted. Without words he told her what had happened, and without words she answered with the one truth that remained intact through every renaming of their lives, which was that choice had been made and could not be unmade without teaching the future to lie. That evening, when he chose to attend the staff meeting at the service wing, rather than the emergency call from investors, it was not a dramatic gesture, but it was unmistakable, and the room fell silent with a respect that both honored and feared him. He told them the truth, that change would come, and that it would not come for them first, and that anyone who wished to leave would be helped to do so without punishment. Some wept and some watched with the faces of people who had learned to read for trapdoors and promises. Emily understood then what it meant to be chosen, not as possession but as access, and the meaning unsettled her with a tenderness she did not know how to protect. Emily chose the day after the board vote, because the aftermath had softened the world into a brittle quiet where truth could travel without shattering everything at once. She found Sebastian in the study before sunrise, with the river still a dark sheet beyond glass, and the city caught between last night and first light. He looked older in that hour, not with loss, but with the kind of clarity that follows it. She stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, and when he noticed her he did not ask why she was there, as if some instinct had learned to wait. She crossed the room without ceremony and placed the folded letter on the desk between them, the unsent confession that had lived against her heart, like a second pulse. "I need to tell you something," she said, and for the first time, her voice did not hide inside itself. He did not reach for the paper yet, and that restraint steadied her more than any interruption could have. The river shifted and light thinned along the edge of the room as if the morning were carving a boundary for what would follow. She spoke without preface because preface made room for retreat. "My father died because of you," she said, and the sentence landed with a quiet that bent the air. Sebastian did not move, and she saw the moment the words changed him, not by force but by permission, as if a gate long suspected had finally been opened. She told him the address, and the year, and how the papers looked on the table that morning, and how her father had become careful with rooms after that, as if walls might be listening for weakness. She told him about the envelope, and the apology, and how no one at the bank ever used his name aloud, though it lived in every page. She did not raise her voice, and she did not accuse with heat, and the control in her telling felt like another wound because it had been learned. When she finished, the room felt too wide to cross. Sebastian turned to the files he had opened days before, and pulled the redevelopment folder free of its careful order. He read the address and the lot number and the margin notes he had once made at speed, and for the first time those marks felt like fingerprints at a scene he could not deny. "I signed it," he said, and the way he said it was not defense but recognition. "The pen felt light that day," he added, as if lightness itself had been a crime. She watched the color drain from his face, and felt no triumph, only a deeper ache, because this was the moment she had rehearsed for years, and it did not transform the world as she had imagined. He stood and moved to the window with the file still open in his hands, and she followed him with her eyes because her body would not move. He closed the folder and held it as if it were a weight he would not set down yet. "I thought relocation was a mercy," he said, and tasted the lie in it. "I did not measure what it asked you to carry." The rain began again softly, as if the sky had learned the proper register for confession. She told him about the house and the porch and the father who sat with radios and the night he emptied into silence, as if he were making room for someone else to live. Sebastian pressed his palms to the glass, and the city blurred his reflection into a man he did not want to recognize, yet could not refuse to become. "I do not deserve your forgiveness," he said, and she answered, "I did not come to offer it." The distinction steadied him because it kept them both inside truth rather than comfort. She told him how she had learned to hate his name because hating gave shape to grief, and how the hatred had kept her alive until it no longer did. He asked why she had stayed after discovering the connection, and she answered, "Because leaving would have made me a shadow of the girl who ran, and I was tired of being a shadow." The river took the rain, and the room took their breath, and the morning finally crossed the threshold. Sebastian returned to the desk, and unfolded the letter without being asked. He read her unsent words, and felt the care in them like a second testimony that asked to be believed. When he looked up, there was no argument left in him, only a fragile resolve that felt newly earned because it had not arrived through leverage. "I will make this right," he said, and she did not stop him because she needed to see what his version of right would choose to be. He named the street and the families, and the compensation he thought would restore something, and she told him that money could build walls and buy time, but it could not resuscitate a life already folded into memory. He listened, and wrote down names not as assets but as people, and the posture of his writing changed, as if the pen had encountered resistance at last. The morning call from the board arrived, and he let it go to quiet, because there were sentences he would not split for their sake again. Emily felt a dangerous hope stir and tamped it down because hope had always asked for proof. She asked him what he would do if the board forced a sale that would erase more streets, and he said he would resign before he signed another page like the one that bore her address. The simplicity of it frightened them both because it carried a future that would not allow retreat dressed as reason. Later that day he drove them together to the river bend, where the redevelopment had begun years ago, and the absence of the street felt like a pulled tooth, the shape still there, and the nerves remembering. He stood beside her without touching, and the space between them felt chosen rather than imposed. He told her what he could repair, and what he would have to learn to hold without remedy. She told him that her father had planted basil in a tin can on the old porch, and that the scent would linger on his hands all afternoon. They stood in the afterimage of a memory neither of them owned completely, and the ground felt honest in its refusal to offer more than it had. On the drive back he asked her whether knowing changed anything, and she said knowing moves the weight, even when the weight remains. At the house he called a meeting with his legal counsel, and named the property and the restitution fund he would establish, without waiting for shareholders to approve the grammar of conscience. The lawyers measured feasibility and risk, and he did not bargain with them in the old way because bargaining would have made the gesture elastic. Emily watched from the edge, and felt the wire inside her slacken, not because the wound was healed but because it was finally being addressed without disguise. That evening she returned to the study and found him at the desk, with the file open again, as if he were reading the past the way one studies a map before choosing a road out of it. "I could leave you now," she said quietly, and he answered, "I know," and the knowledge bruised and steadied them in equal measure. When the city lights kindled, she brought him tea without realizing she had decided to care, and he accepted it, as one accepts weather without claiming custody. The past he had signed away with a pen had come back to claim him with a voice and a face, and he did not turn from it. Emily slept without the letter against her skin for the first time in months, and the absence felt like a breath that could finally fill. In the morning, the headlines spoke of resignations and funds and statements that used his name with a different cadence. None of it named her father, and that was as it would remain, yet the river that once hid a street now carried a new current she did not completely distrust. When she met Sebastian at the stair, she looked at him without armor and saw a man who had been pierced by consequence and had not withdrawn. The knowledge did not soften everything, but it changed the climate in which softness might survive. The war began with flowers delivered at dawn, their pale geometry arranged with a restraint that felt like a warning rather than a courtesy, and Emily knew before she touched the card whose hand had written the silence into it. Victoria Reed requested her presence at the museum terrace at 10, and the words were phrased as invitation only in the sense that winter invites surrender. Sebastian protested when Emily showed him the card, yet she felt the choice settle with a clarity that did not ask for permission, because avoidance had already cost too much. She went alone, not as courage but as arithmetic, because the story was now large enough to demand witnesses in daylight. The terrace hovered above the city, with the river folded into a long grey ribbon, and Victoria stood at the rail with her back turned, as if to rehearse the power of being waited for. When she turned, her smile was composed with the care of someone who had outlived apology. "You look well considering," she said, and Emily heard in the words both the poison and the surgery braided into one convenient kindness. They spoke of weather and traffic and the inconvenience of public restrooms at cultural landmarks, as if the small talk were ballast for the strike to come. Then, Victoria said the engagement had been revived without Sebastian consent, because shareholders respond to continuity and daughters are useful to that grammar when sons forget it. Emily felt the wire tighten, yet she steadied herself with the knowledge that the truth had already crossed one threshold and would not retreat now. "I will not be used to correct his defiance," Emily said, and the simplicity of it startled the air. Victoria stepped closer, and the space chilled by a degree not measurable by instruments, and she spoke of reputations as if they were fabrics one could stain beyond rescue. "Your presence in his life implies a narrative that will devour him," she said, and nakedly named the class that would be shamed by attachment to service uniforms and borrowed rooms. The words were dressed in concern, but the blade was unadorned. Emily answered with a steadiness honed by years of being told what she was not. "Your son has already chosen," she said, and the stillness that followed was an admission of threat, more naked than any raised voice. Victoria listed the consequences with the tenderness of someone distributing famine in precise rations. The fund, he announced, would be litigated into stasis, and the properties reclaimed by banks that know how to look innocent, she said, and the staff he protects now would be disciplined by the quiet means that do not leave scars easily, photographed. Emily felt the terrible neatness of it, because this was how war was waged now, with filings and favors rather than fire. She asked only one question, whether the threat extended to the families named in the restitution fund, and the pause before Victoria answered was the confession that made the answer unnecessary. When Emily returned to the house, Sebastian met her at the door and read the result in her posture before she spoke. She told him what had been offered and what had been promised, and did not soften the sentences to spare him their teeth. He listened without interruption, and the calm in his face frightened her more than anger would have, because it had the finality of a man who has finished counting what he can lose. That evening he summoned counsel and named the assets his mother had mentioned, without consulting the board, and the lawyers exchanged looks that measured disaster with professional admiration. "If we proceed with the fund as announced, the suits will come," they said, and he answered, "Then let the suits teach us whether the law has a spine when money leans on it." Emily watched him move through the rooms with purpose that did not circle back to request her absolution, and the sight of that discipline turned fear into something like faith, though she did not dare to name it. Victoria escalated before midnight with a press leak suggesting impropriety, and the commentators performed their familiar dance of implication without evidence. The House staff found the headlines by morning, and the service wing filled with a silence that remembered other storms too well. Emily felt the burden of their eyes and the injustice of bearing it, yet she stood where she had been commanded to shrink, because shrinking would have taught the lie how to win without being seen. Sebastian held a brief meeting and told them the truth in words that did not promise safety as spectacle, but safety as practice. He repeated that anyone who wished to depart could do so with his help and without penalty, and the room accepted the offer, the way a lifeboat accepts the sea, with trembling, resolve and gratitude braided together. That afternoon, the board issued a letter demanding his immediate attendance and reintegration with the revived engagement as condition for stability. He folded the letter and placed it beside the card with his mother's careful script, and the symmetry made nothing better. Emily asked him again whether she should leave because she would not be the lever by which wars were won, and he answered that she was not a lever but a line, and that lines do not apologize for marking borders. Camera crews gathered by dusk, and the lobby learned the sound of its own nerves as lenses clicked like accusation. Victoria arrived through a side entrance with the confidence of someone certain that the building remembered her weight, and she met Sebastian in the study where walls had learned too many versions of truth. Emily remained in the hall at his request, not as protection but as witness, because he refused to conduct the future where it would feel like a secret. The voices rose and fell without the courtesy of distance, and the name Emily carried entered the room like a match struck near paper. Victoria offered him a choice dressed as Mercy this time, with dates and conditions polished for public digestion. He responded with a question about the families who would be reclaimed, and she answered with legal language that fluidly erased pronouns. The quiet grew dense, and after it he said no, with a clarity that did not lean on theater, and the simplicity of the refusal landed with the violence of a door closed against a tide. Victoria looked past him and saw Emily where she stood, and the look was the kind that assigns fates without asking permission, whether from heaven or earth. "I will unmake what you are trying to salvage," she said, and he replied, "You will show the city what you have always been," and that exchange crystallized a truth the room would not forget. When she left, the press surged and the statements arrived with breathless urgency, and Sebastian declined them all, choosing instead the slow labor of calling banks and mayors and union stewards, and learning what kind of allies survive under names spoken softly. Emily sat alone in the small kitchen at the end of her shift, and felt the dangerous urge to beg him to stop, because begging had once moved the world, and she feared he would not survive the keeping of his promise. He found her there, and for the first time that day permitted himself to look like a man carrying too much with both hands. She told him that if his mother destroyed the fund, she would testify to the block and the address and the father who signed apologies on clean paper, and he told her that he would not allow her to be consumed as evidence for principle nor for his rebellion. The war named itself over the next hours with injunctions and notices and contracts repriced into punishments with impeccable manners. Stock followed suit with a measured fall that looked like patience taught to harm. Through it all, the staff remained, and Emily felt the fragile miracle of it as proof that fear does not always win when given a rival that speaks plainly. That night, as Rain returned without ceremony, he stood by the window and told her the board would move to remove him at the next meeting, and that the proxy numbers would likely be sufficient. She asked what he would do when they did, and he answered with the calm of a man who has spent his regret and would now spend his courage, that he would leave with the fund legally vested beyond reversal, or he would drag the process into it such light that even his mother's long shadow would crack. Emily placed her hand against the glass and felt the vibration of the storm echo in her pulse, and she said, "Then you will not fight alone," and the plain defiance in her voice arrived not as romance but as solidarity, the kind that outlives spectacle. Sirens braided the distance, and the city rehearsed its appetite for endings and beginnings, and the house held its breath for the next sentence. The boardroom was built to swallow sound and return it as authority, and on the morning of the vote, it did exactly that, as voices gathered into a low, disciplined thunder beneath glass and steel. Sebastian took his seat without a jacket and without notes, and the absence of armor unsettled those who depended on ritual to move fear out of sight. The proxy numbers scrolled across a muted screen, and the directors exchanged the looks of people who had already practiced the victory they intended to perform. Emily waited 3 floors below in a quiet conference room with the general counsel and a single aide whose only task was to watch the hall and call if anything went wrong. The call was meant to be a convenience, not a shield, yet when the minutes stretched thin she felt the old kneeling return in her bones, as if her body remembered how to bargain with gravity when language failed. Above her, the chairman cleared his throat and called the motion to order with a voice that had learned to love decisions that do not love back. Grounds were cited and precedent displayed, and the calculus of market confidence was offered as if it were moral instruction. Sebastian listened with a stillness that confused pity with contempt, and the men and women across the table mistook his quiet for the compliance they had purchased so many times before. When his turn came, they expected rebuttal framed in risk models and phase transitions that preserved the appearance of choice while removing its substance. He did not give them that grammar. He stood, and the chair whispered back into place, as if startled by the simplicity of the movement. The room stilled because bodies speak a clarity that slides past argument. He did not begin with history or prognosis. He did not name the merger, or the engagement, or the litigation that had grown into polite myth. He looked at the proxy numbers once as if locating a shoreline, and then said in a voice that carried without raising itself, "If she leaves, I leave everything." The sentence landed without adornment, and for a second, the boardroom forgot how to breathe, because an empire expects negotiation, not resignation. The chairman laughed reflexively, then stopped because the sound had no echo. Someone said this is not how leverage works, and he answered that leverage had worked on him for decades, and that he recognized in himself the moment it named him, rather than the other way around. Another director spoke of fiduciary duty, and he replied that duty empties when it forgets the people it displaces. The general counsel warned of cascading loss, and he said that cascades teach rivers where they are willing to cut. The vote proceeded, because process is what happens when human beings are afraid to think out loud. The motion passed with the arithmetic it had always intended to pass with, and the margins were recorded as if margins could record a weather that had already arrived. The chairman declared his authority curtailed, pending the transition that had been drafted in a drawer long before this day had warmed to life. Sebastian nodded once, because nodding costs nothing and gives no promise. He gathered his phone and rose, and the room felt smaller for the absence of a man who had carried it on his back, without naming the load. When he reached the elevator, he paused long enough to allow the doors to open on him as a courtesy rather than a command, and that small ritual felt like the last inheritance he would accept from the architecture of control. Downstairs, Emily heard the change before the words arrived, because quiet learns the register of consequences long before they are spoken aloud. The general counsel received the call and listened without interruption, and then handed the phone to Emily with a look that did not attempt to pretend what had already happened. Sebastian's voice came through steady and unbroken, and he said, "It is done." The simplicity of it struck her as a kindness, because it did not ask her to imagine the blow it had cost him. She left the room and walked to the lobby, where cameras had already gathered with the hunger of people who feed on endings they do not have to live inside. He emerged from the elevator without rushing and without delay, and the flash burst like rain on a metal roof. A reporter called his name and then asked whether he had lost everything today, and he answered that he had finished pretending to own it. Another asked whether he had chosen a woman over a company, and he replied that he had chosen to become answerable to a sentence he had avoided for too long. The questions multiplied because spectacle prefers multiplication to truth, and he declined them all, not with defiance but with absence, which is the only answer that cannot be edited. He crossed the lobby and stopped where Emily stood with the scarf at her shoulders, and the city reframed itself around the line between them. For one breath, the noise receded, and the choice that had been a posture became a fact with weather and weight. He did not touch her because the moment did not belong to that grammar. He said simply, "We can leave now," and the honesty of it steadied her more than any vow. They walked through glass that had seen too many departures to remember a single one, and the sky opened without commentary. In the car, the phone lit with numbers that belonged to banks and mayors, and men who had learned to rent courage from institutions. He silenced it, and the absence of that hum felt like stepping out of a room where everyone is speaking without listening. Emily watched the river slide past, and felt the ache of consequence with a clarity that did not invite panic, because the fear had already spent its best argument. He drove not homeward but toward the neighborhoods that bore his signature like a scar, because ritual needed to be remade in the company of witnesses who would not applaud. At the first stop, an older woman recognized him and did not thank him, and did not curse him either, but told him the basil had never grown as well anywhere else, and he stood with his hands in his pockets, as if they had learned where to wait. Calls continued to stack, and he returned none of them, and with each unanswered ring, another thread of the empire loosened its claim on the day. By afternoon, the markets had digested the morning with the appetite of a creature that has learned it will be fed again, and the damage arranged itself into columns that pretended indifference. The fund he had announced survived the first wave of injunctions, because he had insulated it in language that borrowed its spine from the courts, rather than the board, and the lawyers found purchase where they did not expect it. Emily felt the relief of that survival as a tremor rather than a celebration, because she had learned what it cost to keep a promise under siege. When the city darkened, he returned to the house he no longer commanded as an owner, and the staff watched in that careful way people watch storms after they pass to see what remains. He told them the truth without flourish, that he would not retaliate, and that their jobs would be protected by the endowment attached to the fund for at least a year, and that beyond that they would decide together where to stand. Some wept because a year is a wide horizon when the present has learned to shrink, and some folded their arms because promises have sheltered many winters without ever opening a door. Emily stood at the back and felt the danger, and the grace braided into one rope, and when he finished, she stepped forward and took his hand without checking whether the cameras could see, because the grammar had changed and required different punctuation. The city learned the sentence quickly and not kindly, and the headlines learned to shout what he had spoken plainly. Before sleep, he found her on the terrace with the river wide and dark, and told her he had not saved the empire because some machines only protect themselves, and she answered that he had saved something smaller, and therefore harder. He watched the water and did not contradict her, and in the quiet between them the choice he had made learned how to be a fact rather than a promise, and the fact weighed and steadied them both at once. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, without return address, tucked inside a stack of forwarded mail that had followed Emily from one borrowed room to another for years, and she did not recognize it at first because she had trained herself to believe that the past only spoke when invited by grief. She slid it open at the kitchen table, while the house slept, and felt the paper tremble between her fingers, as if it remembered being held by hands that were no longer warm. The handwriting was unmistakable, and yet impossible. Her father's careful slope, leaning right as though each word were walking toward her with the patience he had learned too late. "My little star," he had written with the tenderness he used when she was afraid of the dark and needed the night to listen. She pressed her palm against the page to feel the trace of him through ink and air, and steadied her breath because the letter did not ask permission to resurrect him. "I am writing this in advance, because I do not trust my courage on the day I will need it," the first line said, and the honesty of that admission made her smile through tears that had not yet learned where to fall. He wrote of the loss, without naming it as a fault of the house, and the street, and the sound of footsteps that would not return, and she felt the ache loosen its grip, because he was looking at the wound with her instead of leaving her to carry its shape alone. "If you are reading this, then I have made the wrong choice about how to endure," he wrote, and the room seemed to tilt, because the confession had crossed years to land in her hands, with a weight that did not belong to any single day. Emily bowed her head, and let the quiet become a chapel for one without walls. He told her he loved her with the ordinary specificity of fathers, who learned to be brave in sentences rather than in speeches, and reminded her of the basil in a tin can, and the way it grew even when the soil was thin, and she felt the scent rise around her, like memory made edible again. "If you ever meet the man whose name I learned to fear," he wrote, "do not let my fear be the last word between you," and the generosity of that sentence broke something open in her chest that she had kept boarded since the foreclosure notice arrived. He did not absolve Sebastian, and he did not bless him either. He only offered her the right not to inherit a hatred that had already asked for too much. "There is a difference between the signature and the hand that holds it," he wrote, "and sometimes the hand is taught too late what the signature has done." And she thought of Sebastian standing by the river counting consequences that had never learned his face until she gave it back to him. The letter ended not with warning but with permission that made her hands shake. "If you have the chance to love, then love as if loss has already told you what it costs, and do not make your life only a reply to mine." She folded the page and pressed her forehead to the table, because the permission felt heavier than any accusation she had carried, and the sunrise touched the window with a pale promise she was afraid to accept without bargaining. Sebastian found her there an hour later, drawn by the instinct that had learned to recognize the specific quiet of decision. She did not hide the letter because hiding had finished its work and returned only hunger. She handed it to him without explanation, and watched his eyes move through a history he did not own yet had shaped. He read slowly, and when he reached the line about fear not being the last word, his breath caught in a sound so small, it might have been mistaken for nothing if she had not been listening for it all along. "I would have been a different man if I had known him," he said with an ache that did not ask to be contradicted, and she answered that knowing had not saved her father either, yet it had saved something in her. He returned the letter as one returns a living thing, unable to name what thanks would not dishonor, and they sat in the growing light with the river widening between night and day. The staff arrived in ones and twos, and pretended not to notice the change, yet felt it, as one feels a weather shift announced only by birds. Later, Victoria Reed sent another message that spoke of consequences, dressed as reconciliation, and Sebastian placed it beside the letter on the table, and the pairing taught him which paper he would answer, and which he would archive into silence. Emily carried the letter with her through the day and felt it steady her like a hand on her back when rooms leaned toward memory. When fear returned with its practiced arguments, she unfolded the page and let the basil grow again in the narrow space of her breath. By afternoon, the lawyers confirmed the injunctions had failed to freeze the fund, and the victory was technical, not moral, yet it mattered because it meant families would receive letters that were not apologies in advance. Sebastian listened without celebration, and said quietly that technical truths keep people fed until moral ones learn where to stand. Emily watched the care in his face and felt the old wire slacken, another fraction, as if her father himself had loosened it with ink and permission. That evening they walked to the river without speaking, and the water accepted the light with the patience it always had. She told Sebastian that her father had loved radios, and that the man who spoke to him each night about ball games had kept him company when the porch grew empty, and Sebastian confessed small, ordinary losses of his own he had never allowed to take center stage. Their confessions did not balance a ledger, and neither tried to make them do so. They only taught the quiet how to hold two histories at once without asking either to vanish. When the evening cooled, she read the final lines aloud, and the sentence that lifted from the page like a blessing did not belong to a church or a contract, but to the thin, brave space between people who choose not to be only what has happened to them. If you have the chance to love, then love, he had written, and the word love moved through the room like a remade instruction, not toward promise but toward practice. Sebastian did not reach for her, and she did not retreat, because the letter had already crossed the distance they both feared most, which was the one between what had been lost and what still dared to be built. The night closed around them with a gentleness that did not pretend to fix anything, and that honesty felt like the last gift her father had saved for the hour when it would be most needed. The morning the city learned to breathe again arrived without ceremony, as most meaningful mornings do, sliding light across glass and river, and the narrow kitchen where Emily stood trimming basil from a small pot she had planted weeks earlier in a tin can that looked like home. The fund had begun its quiet work by then, with letters traveling outward like small lanterns into neighborhoods that had learned to read for disappointment first and hope second. Families received keys and contracts and apologies shaped into action rather than paragraph, and the work did not make headlines because repair rarely knows how to shout. Sebastian spent those days in rooms that did not carry his name on the door, and learned again the grammar of time, measured by people instead of markets. He drove without a driver, and waited in lines, and listened with a patience that surprised those who had trained themselves to fear his shadow. Emily returned to school with a schedule built between shifts and late nights, and the fatigue that came with choosing a future, rather than only surviving the present. They were not equal, and they did not pretend to be, and yet the space between them had learned a different weather that no longer thundered with threat. One evening the river widened into gold, and the city gathered itself into reflection, and he asked her to walk with him along the promenade where children sketched chalk moons on the stone, and vendors hummed their old songs back into relevance. She agreed without the trembling that had once accompanied every choice that involved his name, and the ease of it made her pause, as if to take inventory of how far she had traveled without noticing. He told her of the latest proxy fight and the way his mother had learned that power does not always obey even the longest practiced hands, and she told him of a class she had passed with a margin that felt like a personal referendum. They laughed at a dog that had decided the river belonged to him, and the laughter surprised them both into stillness, because it fell into the space where fear had once lived. They stopped at the edge, and watched a small boat cut a bright wake through the dusk, and the moment felt unclaimed by argument or defense. Sebastian reached into his pocket, and felt the small box there, as a steady question he had learned to carry without demanding an answer. He did not plan speeches because speeches pretend to end things that only begin again, with different weather. He turned to Emily and said the simplest truth he could reach without borrowing gravity from spectacle, which was that he loved her, and that he would stand where he had stood even if the world learned to scowl at that posture. The word love landed without fireworks and therefore with more force, because nothing rushed to decorate it. Emily felt the sentence travel through her, as if each place it touched paused to decide whether it was safe to keep. She thought of the letter and the basil and the night on the kitchen floor, and she answered with the honesty the letter had given her, which was that she loved him too, and would not use the word as sanctuary from consequence, but as a reason, to walk into it with her eyes open. He did not kiss her then, and the restraint felt like a promise that did not need to perform itself to be believed. They walked on, and reached the small plaza, where street musicians gathered, and a young man bent into a harmonica, with the devotion of someone who understands that breath can be a craft. The crowd thinned into a shallow circle, and an old couple swayed without listening for permission, and the scene felt like an instruction in how ordinary things consent to joy without approval. Sebastian stopped and turned fully to Emily, and something in his posture asked the air to become witness without commanding it. He knelt not as theater, but as balance, and the motion startled the circle into a hush that did not know yet what it was being asked to hold. Emily felt her heart strike a harder rhythm, because kneeling had once been the posture of plea and loss, and she did not know how to read it as an offering, until he looked up with eyes that did not ask for power, but for a future that would continue to require choosing. He opened the box, and the ring carried no myth except the clean light of intention shaped into metal. He said her name, and then he said, "Will you share this life with me as it actually is, and not as anyone has promised it should be?" And the question lifted the last shadow of bargaining from the space between them. Emily did not search the crowd or the sky for permission, and did not feel the old wire tighten in warning. She thought of her father and the basil and the work that waited tomorrow, and the river that would continue with or without ceremony, and she said yes, with a clarity that felt like a rival. Applause broke without being asked, because human hands learn what to do when they recognize themselves in courage that does not pretend to be invincible. The old couple clapped, and the harmonica bent into laughter, and the river took the sound without needing to judge it. Sebastian rose, and they kissed with the city fully present, not as audience, but as weather that did not interfere with breathing. The photographers arrived late, and caught only the end of a sentence that would not be revised to suit them. In the months that followed, they returned to the long labor that had never promised to resolve into applause. The houses were repaired one address at a time, and the basil grew stubborn and fragrant, and Emily wrote her first paper on the ethics of displacement, with a rigor that did not grant easy absolution. Sebastian learned to accept interviews that asked him to practice saying no in languages that did not glorify the refusal. The fund expanded not as monument but as infrastructure, and the board moved on to hunt other certainties less inclined to kneel. Victoria Reed moved into a public quiet that had the shape of retreat without the name, and the city learned her absence with its usual indifference. On a winter morning that did not bother to look back, they married at the courthouse without procession or permission, and wore warmth where formality would usually live. The clerk congratulated them with the brevity learned in rooms where love arrives without spectacle, and they stepped into cold that did not threaten because a shared heat had learned its own language. That night, the staff gathered around a long table that had learned to be honest about who sat at its head and who set its food, and there was no head, and therefore no argument about it. They toasted with whatever glasses were nearest, and Emily told them she would finish school and remain in the work in a different capacity, and Sebastian told them the same truth differently, that he would remain only as answerable as work required him to be. The river kept count as it always had, and the basil outgrew its tin and moved into the ground with roots that did not require a deed to believe where they belonged. When spring returned, it did not ask what had changed, and yet the city answered with a softer hand on the door of the day. They walked the promenade again, where chalk moons had faded into memory, and nothing marked the place where he had knelt, except the familiar patience of stone, watching feet learn their reasons. Emily sometimes brought the letter with her, and did not need to read it to feel its edge against her life, the way one feels the spine of a book that has already taught the lesson it carries. Sebastian sometimes traced the scar of the river in the window, and remembered how the empire had sounded when it left, and how the quieter labor sounded now as it stayed. They did not say that everything had been healed, because that language would have made a debt of what had already been paid by choosing, and by continuing to choose when choosing no longer felt dramatic. They said instead that they were building, and the word building fit the work, because it names process rather than arrival. In the evening they kept the windows open, and let the city speak itself to sleep, and the sound was not verdict, but company. And in the shared quiet that followed two lives that had learned to kneel for different reasons, learned at last how to stand without borrowing height from anyone else, Emily sometimes still woke before dawn out of old habit, and found the kitchen already warm with coffee, because Sebastian had learned her hours as carefully as he once learned markets, and the small domestic rituals felt like a second education neither of them had known they needed. The foundation grew quietly through seasons and storms, with no gala to crown it, and no headlines to defend it, and yet houses rose where absence once practiced its grammar, and children learned new addresses without learning the word. Foreclosure first. Emily finished her degree with a paper that unsettled more than it soothed, because she refused to smooth the edges of harm for comfort, and her professor called it brave, in the way people say brave when they mean necessary. Sebastian sat in back as a visitor without privilege, and listened as if the lecture were addressed to the worst and the best of him at once, and afterward he did not offer commentary, only his hand and the weight of it steadied her more than any praise could. On the anniversary of the river bend, they returned to the place where the street had been, and planted basil in the soil, with a small marker that carried no names, and the wind did not ask who it was for. Victoria Reed attended the dedication of a new clinic without speaking to them, and the civility held like frost that knows how to keep its distance, and that was enough. The old couple from the promenade sometimes appeared at neighborhood events, and waved as if they shared a secret neither party needed to explain. When the city tried to crown Sebastian with a redemption narrative, he declined it and redirected the cameras to the people who had learned to rebuild without applause, and the refusal taught the story a different ending. Emily learned to sleep without bracing, and sometimes felt guilt at the ease and then remembered the letter and let permission do its work. On late nights when fear returned with clever arithmetic, they sat on the balcony and listened to the river until the numbers lost their teeth. They argued about ordinary things like dishes and calendars, and whose turn it was to buy basil, and those arguments felt like the most radical peace either had known. In the third spring, a little girl ran up at a ribbon cutting, and handed Emily a crayon drawing of a house with too many windows and a garden that cannot exist, and Emily kept it on the refrigerator as proof that imagination had learned to trust ground again. Sebastian began teaching a free seminar on ethics and consequence at a community college where nobody mistook his past for legend, and the students asked him questions that refused to resolve into slogans, and he answered them with the honesty of someone who had already paid for the vanity of certainty. When the basil outgrew its patch, they gave the extra to neighbors, and the neighbors traded tomatoes, and no one built a story out of it, because the exchange had learned to be ordinary. On nights when thunder came back with the old voice of urgency, Emily still startled, and Sebastian still reached, and neither pretended the reflex was weakness, because it was simply memory moving through muscle. They learned that love after upheaval does not arrive as rescue but as practice, and that practice feels quiet most days, and that the quiet is not empty. The city changed again because cities always do, and their names drifted across articles and then off them, and the work continued with or without witness, because repair does not require applause to continue breathing. Years later, when a student asked Emily what the turning point had been, she did not name the poison or the boardroom or the kneeling, and said only that it was the moment she stopped arranging her life as a reply to loss and started letting it ask questions of its own. When asked the same, Sebastian said that the sentence he spoke in the boardroom had not given up an empire so much as it had stopped giving himself away to one he no longer believed in. On an evening that looked like any other, they stood at the river and watched a new bridge take shape from both sides at once, and Emily said quietly that sometimes the best proof of change is that it looks unremarkable from a distance, and Sebastian smiled because unremarkable had become their favorite word for the future.